Anthony Caruso says Bumpy Johnson will never find me. He stole $50,000 and built 5 exits. He has 3 weeks of supplies and 1 loaded gun. 4 minutes later, Bumpy is standing behind him. Not revenge, not pride, strategy. So how did a man disappear in a city of millions, yet walk straight into judgment? To understand that, we go back to the first mistake. The warehouse stretched 12,000 square feet into the Brooklyn waterfront darkness, a concrete tomb where even the rats had learned to walk carefully. No electricity hummed through the walls, no water dripped from rusty pipes, only the weak yellow glow of a single lantern casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the empty floor. Anthony Caruso sat on a wooden crate, his weight pressed down on the canvas bag beneath him, $50,000 in unmarked bills that represented both his fortune and his grave. The August night pushed through the cracks in the walls. It carried with it the cold breath of the East River, the metallic smell of industrial decay, and the distant sound of tugboats traveling through channels that had swallowed better men than him. Tommy Russo stood 3 meters away. His cigarette tip glowed orange in the darkness. His eyes were fixed on the main door with the intensity of a man watching his own execution approach. The smoke curled upward, disappearing into the rafters where pigeons had once lived before even they abandoned this place. "Bumpy Johnson will never find me," Caruso said. His voice carried the kind of certainty that men have right before the world proves them wrong in the most permanent way possible. Tommy took a long drag and exhaled slowly. The smoke seemed to carry words he would not speak aloud, truths that would remain locked behind his teeth until the moment they no longer mattered. From somewhere across the water, muffled by distance and the weight of night itself, Duke Ellington's horn played through the air from a dockside bar where dock workers drank away wages they could not afford to lose. The music twisted in the wind, notes bending into something that sounded less like jazz and more like a funeral march played backwards. "You really believe that?" Tommy asked, and there was something in his tone that should have sounded like a warning, a flatness that suggested he had already made calculations that did not include Caruso's survival. "I know it," Caruso said, leaning back against the brick wall, feeling the cold seep through his jacket. 3 weeks of food, a boat waiting, 5 different ways out of this place. He can search from now until Christmas. He will find nothing but empty buildings and closed doors. Tommy nodded. He flicked ash onto the concrete floor where it joined decades of dirt and trash. "And what happens when Christmas comes and you are still breathing? You think $50,000 just disappears from the books. You think 2 families forget that kind of insult." Caruso's hand moved to the revolver resting beside him. His fingers curled around the grip with the familiar comfort of a man who had used such tools before. A man who understood that survival sometimes required reducing another human being to a problem that bullets could solve. "By Christmas I will be in Miami. New name, new face, new life. Let them search Brooklyn forever. Let them waste their time and their resources chasing a ghost." "Bumpy does not chase ghosts," Tommy said quietly, and in that moment the cigarette tip glowed brighter as he inhaled, lighting up features that showed no loyalty, no friendship. Nothing but the cold thinking of a man who had already accepted payment for betrayal. "He creates them." The lantern flickered, shadows got smaller and then bigger, and Caruso felt something change in the air, a change in pressure that came before storms and violence and the kind of reckoning that left families crying over closed caskets. He told himself it was paranoia, exhaustion, the natural anxiety of a man who had just bet his life on preparation and luck. But in the spaces between heartbeats, in that ancient part of the brain that evolution designed to detect predators, he sensed what reason refused to accept. Behind the false wall he had built from salvaged plywood and careful measurement, a 5th exit waited, known only to him and Tommy. A passage that opened onto an alley where delivery trucks once backed up to receive shipments that customs agents never recorded. 3 main doors reinforced with steel bars he had installed himself, windows boarded and nailed shut, every normal entrance sealed against break-ins. He had thought of everything, checked every angle, expected every approach. But the warehouse had a 6th entrance, a skylight access point that maintenance workers had used when this building still served legitimate business before it became just another monument to Brooklyn's slow industrial death. Glass panels covered by tar paper, reachable from the roof, a route that building plans showed but memory forgot. And above them, unknown to Caruso, unseen in the darkness of rafters and beams, Bumpy Johnson had already been standing for 6 minutes. Watching, listening, waiting for the exact moment when confidence would make a man careless enough to die. Outside, the river kept flowing, the tugboats kept calling, and Duke Ellington's horn kept playing for men who would never make it home. Inside, in the last moments before everything changed, Anthony Caruso sat on 50,000 reasons why stealing from 2 families meant digging 2 graves. And Tommy Russo smoked his cigarette with the patience of Judas counting silver. And somewhere in the darkness above, justice prepared to come down with the weight of certainty and the speed of falling hammers. The meeting took place in a social club on Mulberry Street, where decisions got made that courts would never review and newspapers would never print. 3 men from the Colombo family sat across from Bumpy Johnson, their suits pressed sharp enough to cut skin, their faces carrying the kind of tension that comes from delivering bad news to someone who has buried men for less. The walls remembered 40 years of such conversations, plaster holding secrets that would send half of Little Italy to prison if concrete could testify. Vincent Calabrese spoke first, his voice measured and careful like a man defusing a bomb with words instead of wire cutters. The situation with Anthony Caruso requires discussion, Bumpy. $50,000 has gone missing from our joint operation and the man responsible has disappeared like smoke in a hurricane. Bumpy sat in a leather chair that had witnessed more confessions than most priests, a glass of Barolo in his hand. The 1934 vintage he saved for times that demanded clarity rather than celebration. He did not interrupt, did not nod, did not offer any sign that he was hearing anything beyond the normal noise of the city bleeding through the windows. His stillness carried more threat than another man's rage. "We discovered the theft on August 15th during routine checking," Calabrese continued. Sweat had begun forming at his temples despite the ceiling fan turning lazy circles overhead. Caruso falsified receipts across 6 weeks, created fake bets, adjusted ledgers with precision that suggests he has been planning this for months. The money belongs half to your organization, half to ours, which makes this a problem we share. "Shared problems require shared solutions," Bumpy said, his first words since the meeting began, and they landed in the room with the finality of a casket being lowered into earth. Calabrese nodded quickly, eager to move past the idea that his family's carelessness had created problems for Bumpy's operation. "We request permission to handle this matter internally, to show that when our people step out of line, we correct the situation ourselves without requiring outside help." 1 week, Bumpy said, and the 2 words compressed time into something that could be held in a closed fist and squeezed until it bled. "If Caruso does not appear by August 19th, if your people have not produced results that settle the debt owed to my organization, then I will find him myself. And we will settle accounts according to methods that leave no confusion about consequences." The 3 Colombo representatives understood they were being dismissed with a deadline that carried the weight of an ultimatum. Calabrese stood, buttoned his jacket with hands that wanted to shake but refused to show weakness. "We will find him, Bumpy. The man worked for us 17 years. We know his habits, his friends, his family. He cannot hide from people who know him that well." Bumpy raised the wine glass, studied light passing through red liquid that had survived wars and crossed oceans, and spoke with the gentleness that comes before extreme violence the way silence comes before thunder. "If you knew him that well, Vincent, he would not have stolen $50. While you counted pennies and congratulated yourselves on your bookkeeping. You knew the man you wanted him to be, not the man he actually was. And that kind of blindness gets people killed in ways that closed casket funerals cannot hide." The room absorbed those words, held them, allowed them to settle into understanding that this conversation had just shifted from negotiation to warning. Calabrese nodded once, turned toward the door, and led his men out into Mulberry Street where evening business continued, unaware of sentences being pronounced in rooms where leather chairs held the weight of judges who answered to no court except their own sense of order. When the door closed, when the footsteps faded, when silence reclaimed the space, Bumpy finished his wine and set the glass down with the kind of care that suggested he was already calculating distances and angles, and the specific uses of force that would be required to solve an equation that had too many variables and only one acceptable answer. 17 years meant nothing when measured against betrayal. And $50,000 represented more than money. It represented the assumption that theft could occur without response, that boundaries existed only until someone decided to cross them. In another part of Brooklyn, Anthony Caruso sat in a warehouse, convincing himself that preparation equaled safety, that locked doors and loaded guns could protect him from men who had been solving such problems since before he learned to walk. He had 3 weeks of food, 5 exits, a boat waiting to carry him toward a future that would never arrive. He had everything except the one thing that might have saved him. The understanding that Bumpy Johnson did not search for missing men the way police departments circulated descriptions and knocked on doors. Bumpy found people by understanding what they feared, what they needed, what they trusted, and then using those vulnerabilities to turn the entire city into a machine designed to deliver them into his hands. He would not search 12,000 warehouses looking for one frightened thief. He would make the warehouse irrelevant, make the locks meaningless, make the gun useless by approaching the problem from an angle that Caruso's preparation had never considered. By August 19th, the Colombo family had produced nothing except apologies and frustration. Their week of searching yielded empty apartments and closed mouths and the kind of dead ends that suggested Caruso had learned more from 17 years of observation than anyone had given him credit for knowing. They returned to Mulberry Street carrying failure like a body they could not bury. 3 men in suits delivering news that would determine whether this remained business or became something that required Brooklyn to remember why certain names inspired caution. "We have found nothing," Calabrese admitted, and the words cost him something visible, a lessening that showed in the way his shoulders carried his jacket. "The wife and children have disappeared. The usual contacts deny knowledge. The places we expected him to run have produced no trace. Either he is better at this than we expected or he had help from someone we have not identified." Bumpy sat in the same leather chair, no wine this time, no ceremony, just cold evaluation of failure being presented as explanation. His jaw tightened, a subtle shift that men who understood such signals recognized as the moment before violence stopped being theoretical and became real. He did not raise his voice, did not need to. The quiet carried more weight than shouting ever could. "You gave me your word that you would find him within 1 week, Vincent. You staked your family's reputation on your ability to clean up a mess that occurred under your supervision, using your people, in operations you claim to control. Now you stand in my presence telling me that one thief with a head start has made fools of an organization that has run this city for 30 years. Calabrese opened his mouth, closed it, understood that any response would only make things worse. Bumpy stood, moved to the window, looked out at Mulberry Street where ordinary people conducted ordinary business, unaware that above them men were deciding how much restraint mercy required and when necessity demanded that examples be made from failures. "I will find Anthony Caruso," Bumpy said, and his reflection in the window glass showed no anger, no frustration, just the absolute certainty of a man who had never made a promise he could not keep. "I will recover the $50,000 he stole from our joint operation. I will make sure that his wife and children understand what happens when husbands and fathers place their own greed above their family's safety. And I will send a message that reaches every corner of this city about what happens when men confuse my patience with weakness." He turned from the window, faced the 3 Colombo representatives who suddenly looked smaller than their suits, lessened by proximity to will that did not bend or break or accept limitation. "When I find him, and I will find him before this month ends, I will bring him to you so that you can participate in the education he receives about the cost of betrayal. Consider it a courtesy, a recognition that our business relationship requires mutual respect, even when individual members of your organization have shown they have none. Calabrese nodded, relief and dread mixing in an expression that suggested he understood being present for Caruso's reckoning would require witnessing things that would visit him in dreams for whatever years remained. "We appreciate the courtesy, Bumpy. Whatever help you require from our resources, you have only to ask." "I require nothing except that you remember this conversation when other men in your organization begin thinking that stealing from Bumpy Johnson represents acceptable risk," he said, and the words carried finality that made dismissal unnecessary. The Colombo men left, and Mulberry Street swallowed them back into the flow of evening traffic and fatting light and the ordinary patterns of a city that contained within it predators and prey and the ancient mathematics that governed which category any given person occupied. Inside the social club, Bumpy returned to his leather chair, poured another glass of Barolo, and began making phone calls to people who owed him favors, who feared him more than they feared the Colombos, who understood that information had value and silence had cost. Somewhere in Brooklyn, in a warehouse that Anthony Caruso believed represented salvation, Tommy Russo was accepting $10,000 to answer one question about architectural details and loyalties that could be purchased. The hunting had begun, and the prey did not yet understand that every locked door and loaded gun meant nothing against a man who had already bought the key and corrupted the guardian. 4 days remained until Caruso would discover that preparation without wisdom only meant dying with your eyes open. The office in Harlem existed 3 floors above a restaurant that served collard greens and cornbread to people who asked no questions about the men who climbed the back stairs after midnight. Bumpy Johnson sat behind a desk scarred with cigarette burns and coffee rings, artifacts of 20 years making decisions that shaped neighborhoods and ended lives. A single lamp cast yellow light across maps of Brooklyn spread like autopsy diagrams, each street and warehouse marked with the kind of attention that surgeons give to cuts before the first incision. Anthony Caruso was not stupid, and that made him dangerous in ways that stupid men never achieved. He had money, $50,000 that could purchase new identities and passage to places where Brooklyn's reach faded into rumor. He had sanctuary, some warehouse where loyal friends provided cover and early warning. He had escape routes, multiple exits and backup plans and security that suggested criminal sophistication. Random searching would produce nothing except wasted resources, which was exactly what Caruso counted on. The assumption that even Bumpy Johnson could not find a man who truly wanted to disappear. But Bumpy did not hunt men the way police departments circulated descriptions and knocked on doors. He hunted by understanding that every human being carried vulnerabilities that could be identified, exploited, and weaponized. That isolation was an illusion maintained only until someone found the right pressure point to collapse the entire structure of assumed safety. He lifted the glass of Barolo, the 1934 vintage that had survived wars and ocean crossings, swirled the wine with thinking patience. The first step required following something that could not hide, something that left traces even when the man himself vanished. Money was invisible, but the things money purchased left marks that patient investigators could read like road maps to secret locations. Find me everyone who bought large quantities of canned food, bottled water, and non-perishable supplies in the Brooklyn waterfront area during the past 2 weeks, Bumpy said to Marcus Webb, his lieutenant, who had been taking notes in deliberate messiness that protected information if notebooks ever fell into wrong hands. Focus on purchases that exceeded normal household amounts, anything that suggests someone preparing for long isolation. Marcus nodded, understanding that this first thread would lead to others, that Caruso's preparation had required transactions that created records. 3 grocery stores, 2 warehouse suppliers, 5 small markets that served the docks. All would be visited by men asking questions that sounded casual but carried hints about what happened to people who valued customer privacy over Bumpy Johnson's curiosity. The second step addressed the basic weakness in every criminal business, the assumption that loyalty could be purchased and maintained forever. Caruso had not disappeared alone into that warehouse darkness. Someone was with him, someone he trusted enough to share his location, someone whose continued silence represented the only thing standing between Caruso's hiding place and discovery. Tommy Russo, Bumpy said, and the name hung in the air like smoke after gunfire. 17 years Caruso worked with the Colombos, and for 16 of those years Tommy Russo stood beside him. If Caruso is hiding somewhere in Brooklyn, Tommy knows where, and if Tommy knows, then Tommy can be convinced to share that knowledge. "You want me to bring him in for conversation?" Marcus asked. "I want you to offer him $10,000, Bumpy said, and the amount landed like a diagnosis confirming terminal illness. $5,000 delivered immediately in cash. Another $5,000 when Caruso is located and the debt is settled. Make certain Tommy understands this is not negotiation or threat. It is simple business offer that values his cooperation more than the Colombos value his continued existence." The mathematics were exact and brutal, an equation that balanced Tommy's loyalty against his survival instinct, his friendship against his bank account. $10,000 represented more money than Tommy would earn in 2 years of legitimate work. Enough to relocate or retire or simply continue living in a city where refusing Bumpy Johnson's offer meant accepting consequences that surgeons could not repair. The third step required understanding the physical space where Caruso had gone to hide. Building permits filed with the city provided blueprints that showed original construction, every door and window and access point that builders had included. Bumpy studied these documents with the intensity of a general planning an assault, understanding that Caruso would have secured obvious entrances but might have overlooked the skylight that workers used 40 years ago, the roof hatch that maintenance crews accessed for repairs. The fourth step recognized that waiting was a weapon more effective than bullets when used with proper timing. Every hour Caruso spent in his hiding place would convince him that his preparation had succeeded, that Bumpy's search had failed, that safety was permanent. Confidence would make him careless, and paranoia would make him reveal his location through some small mistake that patient watchers could catch. "We do not move until Caruso believes he has won," Bumpy said to the empty office. "Let him sit in his warehouse counting his money and congratulating himself on his cleverness. Then when his guard drops and his confidence peaks, we remind him that in this city, on these streets, no one disappears unless I permit it." On August 16th, Tommy Russo received a visit in his apartment on Hicks Street. 3 men in suits who did not knock so much as announce their presence through the door in tones that suggested resistance would be measured in broken bones. He opened the door, understanding that this moment had been approaching since the day Caruso disappeared. That closeness to betrayal made him suspect even if he remained technically innocent. Marcus Webb sat across from Tommy in a kitchen where breakfast dishes still filled the sink, where morning light pushed through windows filmed with years of dirt. He placed an envelope on the table, bulging with currency that represented both offer and threat. $5,000, Marcus said, his voice carrying no emotion, just flat delivery of terms that would not be negotiated. "You tell us where Anthony Caruso is hiding, we verify the information. You receive another $5,000 when the situation is resolved. Alternatively, you remain loyal to a man who stole from 2 organizations and is currently living on borrowed time." Tommy looked at the envelope, at Marcus, at the 2 men standing behind whose postures suggested they were present for enforcement if negotiation failed. $5,000 sat on his table, real and solid and capable of solving problems that loyalty could not address. "Everyone says Bumpy always finds who he is looking for," Tommy said, and the words came out flat, defeated, the voice of a man who had already made his decision before the offer arrived. Marcus nodded, understanding that this was consent dressed as observation. The information poured out in sentences that carried the weight of confession. Details about the old Greenpoint warehouse on Noble Street, about entrances and exits and defensive preparations, about the skylight that Caruso had forgotten. Tommy described the layout with the precision of a man who had helped plan the hiding place. Who knew which doors locked from inside and which windows offered sight lines to approaching threats? When the catalog of betrayal ended, Marcus placed the envelope in Tommy's hands with ceremonial gravity. The remainder will be delivered when Bumpy confirms that your information was accurate and complete. If you have lied, if Caruso is not where you say he is, then the same men who brought you this money will return to collect a different kind of payment. Tommy nodded, fingers closing around the envelope with the desperate grip of a drowning man grabbing debris, understanding that he had just purchased his own survival by selling someone else's location. The men left, leaving Tommy alone in his kitchen with money that already felt dirty, currency that would spend the same as any other bills but would carry associations that whiskey could not wash away. In his Harlem office, Bumpy received the report with the satisfaction of a mathematician solving an equation that had resisted solution. Noble Street Warehouse, Greenpoint, skylight access from the roof, Caruso's routines and defensive positions laid out with the clarity of architectural drawings. He checked his watch, calculated how long patience should continue before action became necessary. "We move on August 23rd, Bumpy said to Marcus. 9:40 at night when darkness provides cover and Caruso has settled into evening routines that make him predictable. We enter through the skylight, go down to the warehouse floor, and remind Anthony Caruso that in this city, the only thing more dangerous than stealing $50,000 is believing you can hide from the man you stole it from." The roof of the Noble Street warehouse stretched flat and empty under August stars that flickered through industrial haze. Constellations hidden by smoke and light pollution and the built-up breath of a city that never stopped burning fuel and ambition and lives. Bumpy Johnson moved across tar paper and gravel with careful silence, understanding that early noise meant failed operations, and failed operations meant targets who escaped to tell about methods that worked best when witnesses remained permanently silent. 9:43 in the evening, 6 minutes before Anthony Caruso would make his declaration of victory. Bumpy carried a small can of machine oil in his jacket pocket, the kind that mechanics used to silence squeaking hinges. The skylight waited ahead, glass panels covered with tar paper that someone had applied years ago and never removed. A forgotten entrance that building plans showed but current occupants had dismissed as unimportant. Marcus Webb and 2 others spread across the roof in positions that allowed observation of all 4 sides, watching for movement below or approach from nearby buildings. But the warehouse remained still, no guards walking circuits, no lookouts scanning rooftops, just the false confidence of a man who believed that locked doors on the ground floor meant security against threats that might arrive from above. Bumpy knelt beside the skylight, examined the hinges that controlled the glass panels, noted rust and neglect and decay that 40 years without maintenance produced. He applied oil with surgical precision, working the liquid into metal joints that had not moved since workers stopped climbing to the roof for cigarette breaks. The oil seeped into rust, creating lubrication that would allow silent movement when the moment arrived. Below, separated by 12 feet of empty air and glass panels that Caruso had never considered as vulnerability, Anthony sat on his wooden crate and spoke words that would become epitaph rather than victory speech. "Bumpy Johnson will never find me." And the certainty in his voice carried across the warehouse, bounced off concrete walls, reached through the skylight to where Bumpy listened with the patience of a predator watching prey announce its location. Tommy Russo sat 3 meters away, cigarette glowing in darkness, and in that moment he must have felt the weight of $10,000 pressing against his conscience. The specific gravity of betrayal measured in currency that spent the same as honestly earned money but carried associations that would visit him in whatever dreams remained. 9:49 and 17 seconds. Bumpy's hands closed around the skylight frame, applied upward pressure that hinges accepted without protest. The glass panel rose like a coffin lid opening in reverse, revealing the warehouse interior where lantern light cast shadows that danced like mourners at a funeral not yet scheduled. 9:50 and 43 seconds. Bumpy's feet touched concrete floor with impact that produced less sound than Tommy's breathing. A landing that 17 years of experience had refined into technique that bordered on supernatural. He stood in shadows beyond the lantern's reach, allowed his eyes to adjust, studied the scene with detached interest. 9:50 and 47 seconds. Tommy's eyes found Bumpy in the darkness, and whatever he felt, guilt or relief or simple acceptance, it showed in subtle shifting of posture that caught Caruso's peripheral attention. Caruso turned, saw the figure coming from shadows, and understanding arrived with the crushing weight of certainty. 4 minutes, Bumpy said, and his voice carried no anger, no triumph, no emotion except flat delivery of fact. Caruso's hand moved toward the revolver resting beside him, fingers closing around grip with desperate speed. But Marcus Webb appeared behind him, own weapon already drawn and pressed against the base of Caruso's skull with pressure that communicated how quickly resistance would transform into immediate ending. "The gun stays where it is," Marcus said, tone suggesting this was instruction rather than negotiation. "Hands on top of your head, fingers locked together, stay exactly as you are until told otherwise." Caruso complied, understanding that survival required obedience now. His hands rose, fingers locked together, and in that posture of surrender he looked toward Tommy with an expression that contained questions and accusations and the kind of betrayal that destroys assumptions about loyalty. Tommy met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds before looking down at the concrete floor where cigarette ash had built up. His voice came out quiet, almost apologetic, but carrying underneath the hard edge of justification. "He paid more," Tommy said, and the words landed like small bullets. $10,000, half up front, half when you were located. I am sorry, Anthony, but $10,000 buys a lot of things, including the information about where you have been hiding and how Bumpy could reach you through a skylight you forgot existed." Caruso's face showed a progression of emotions, denial giving way to understanding, understanding bleeding into rage, rage collapsing into exhausted acceptance. His jaw clenched, teeth grinding with pressure that could crack molars. 17 years, Caruso said, voice carrying the weight of betrayal measured not in money but in time. 17 years we worked together, collected together, buried problems together, and you sell me for $10,000 like I am merchandise at a discount warehouse. Tommy had no response except continued examination of floor and ash, silence that was answer enough. Confirmation that Caruso's math was correct even if his conclusion had arrived too late. Bumpy moved into the lantern light, approached deliberate and unhurried, a man who had already won and needed no dramatic show. He stopped 3 feet from Caruso, close enough for conversation without closeness. 4 minutes from your declaration of safety to your understanding that safety was fiction, Bumpy said, tone conversational, almost teaching. 4 minutes to locate you, enter this warehouse, position people, and show that every locked door and loaded gun means nothing when the man hunting you has already purchased your protection and studied blueprints that show entrances you forgot existed. Caruso said nothing, understood that words would change nothing, that this moment had been written in consequences the instant he decided that $50,000 was worth stealing from 2 organizations whose tolerance for theft measured somewhere between 0 and absolutely never. The money, Bumpy continued, gesturing toward the canvas bag beneath the wooden crate. $50,000 that belongs half to the Colombo family, half to my organization. It will be recovered, divided according to original agreement. And your theft will be corrected through means that balance sheets do not record but street accountants understand perfectly. Marcus moved the bag, lifted it with both hands, felt the weight of currency that had cost Caruso everything and purchased nothing except temporary sanctuary that had lasted exactly 9 days. Tommy receives his second payment, Bumpy said, looking toward the man who had sold location for currency. $5,000 for information that proved accurate and complete, delivered as promised, because unlike some people in this warehouse, I honor agreements and pay debts when payment comes due. Tommy nodded, still studying floor, still unable to raise eyes toward Caruso, who sat with hands on head and future measured in hours rather than years. Now we go, Bumpy said, and the words carried finality that needed no explanation. The Colombo family has been invited to participate. courtesy and respect for joint venture that you violated. They will appreciate the opportunity to show that when their people steal, correction is given according to standards that maintain reputation and discourage repetition. 2 more men came from darkness, carrying restraints that would make resistance pointless during transportation from warehouse to wherever education would be given. Caruso did not fight, simply allowed hands to be secured behind back with efficiency that suggested extensive practice. 9:57 in the evening, exactly 14 minutes after Caruso had declared that Bumpy Johnson would never find him, exactly 4 minutes after Bumpy had appeared to correct that assumption. The warehouse returned to silence, lantern left burning on the floor where it would die when fuel was used up. Tommy remained behind, smoking another cigarette, alone with concrete and shadows and the specific weight of $10,000 that would need to be spent somewhere other than Brooklyn. The boat that was supposed to carry Caruso to Florida sat empty at the dock, waiting for passengers who would never board. The 5 exits, the 3 weeks of supplies, the careful planning, all made meaningless by a skylight and a purchased betrayal. Outside, Brooklyn continued its night rhythms, factories running third shift, bars serving drinks to men who worked with their hands. And somewhere in that darkness, in a basement or warehouse where soundproofing made screaming pointless, Anthony Caruso would receive education about the specific cost of stealing $50,000 from 2 organizations at once. Lessons delivered with precision that accountants could not measure but bodies would remember for whatever time remained. The black Cadillac sat idling on Noble Street with its headlights off, engine purring like a predator that had fed recently and would feed again before dawn arrived to interrupt the night's work. Anthony Caruso came down the warehouse steps with Marcus Webb's pistol pressed against his spine, hands restrained behind his back with steel cuffs that had been tightened to the point where circulation became theoretical and numbness became certainty. His feet found each step through muscle memory rather than vision. The warehouse exit leading not toward freedom but toward education that basement rooms provided when mistakes required correction beyond what words could accomplish. Bumpy Johnson stood beside the vehicle, the canvas bag containing $50,000 resting at his feet like a hunting trophy that required careful accounting before mounting could begin. He looked at Caruso with the clinical detachment of a butcher evaluating livestock, calculating not whether punishment would occur, but rather the exact method that would transform theft into lesson that Brooklyn's underworld would discuss in whispers for years after the screaming stopped and the cleanup crews finished their work. 25,000 returns to the Colombo family, Bumpy said, and his voice carried the flat tone of an accountant reading balance sheets. Numbers that represented not abstract currency but concrete consequences measured in shattered bones and cut tendons, and the specific sounds that men make when education becomes something that emergency rooms cannot reverse. They're half of the joint venture that you stole while pretending loyalty and skill. The remaining 25,000 covers expenses occurred during your location and recovery, including payments to informants, compensation for time invested, and the cost of showing to the city that stealing from Bumpy Johnson represents the kind of mistake that families mourn at funerals where closed caskets spare mourners from viewing what education looks like when given without restraint or mercy. Caruso wanted to speak, wanted to offer explanation or apology or some combination of words that might reduce the sentence that silence had already pronounced. But his throat had closed around sounds that would not form, vocal cords paralyzed by understanding that arrived too late to change outcome. That whatever he said now would change nothing except perhaps the length of his suffering, and even that change would depend on whether Bumpy interpreted words as regret or additional insult requiring its own separate response. No anger, Bumpy continued, and the observation was directed not at Caruso but at the night itself, at Brooklyn's industrial landscape that stretched away in all directions, at the universe of consequences that theft had set in motion when Anthony decided that $50,000 was worth betting his spine and kneecaps and finger joints against the possibility that preparation could substitute for wisdom. No shouting or rage or emotional display that accomplishes nothing except revealing weakness. Just mathematics, pure and simple, Debts that must be settled according to principles that predate written law and will survive long after courts crumble into dust and judges are forgotten by descendants who never learn their names. Marcus opened the Cadillac's rear door, placed one hand on Caruso's head in the manner that police use when loading suspects into patrol cars, applied downward pressure that communicated how resistance would be received and what consequences would follow if cooperation transformed into struggle. Caruso folded into the vehicle's interior, shoulder-striking leather upholstery that smelled of cigars and cologne and the built-up residue of previous passengers who had made this same journey toward basements where soundproofing made witnesses irrelevant and isolation made help impossible. The boat that was supposed to carry Caruso toward Florida, a new identity in life unburdened by Brooklyn's long memory, sat abandoned at the dock 300 yards south, engine cold, fuel tank full, waiting for a captain who would never arrive to turn the key and point the bow toward open water and freedom that had been illusion from the moment Tommy Russo accepted $5,000 and began calculating whether friendship was worth more than financial security. By morning, the boat would be gone, taken back by men who understood that abandoned assets represented opportunity, that Caruso's preparation had created resources that could be given to people whose loyalty had not yet been tested and found catastrophically lacking. The 5 exits that Caruso had prepared with such careful attention, the reinforced doors and boarded windows and secret passage behind the false wall, all of them remained locked and sealed and completely unimportant now that the only exit that mattered was the one provided by men who had entered through the skylight he had forgotten existed. His 3 weeks of supplies would be discovered eventually by whoever claimed the warehouse next. Canned goods and bottled water that would inspire questions about what kind of desperation drives a man to stock a fortress that could not protect him from his own miscalculations. 9:57 in the evening, exactly 10 minutes after Bumpy had come down through the skylight like judgment falling from heaven that had lost interest in mercy. The Cadillac pulled away from Noble Street and merged into Brooklyn's nighttime traffic. Other vehicles passed without noticing anything unusual. Drivers focused on their own destinations and problems, unaware that the black sedan carrying Anthony Caruso contained within it a story that would be told in social clubs and corner bars for decades after the main people had returned to dust, and the details had been polished through repetition into something approaching myth. Tommy Russo remained in the warehouse, alone with the dying lantern and the cigarette that had burned down to filter, alone with $10,000 that would need to be spent carefully in cities where his name carried no associations and his face prompted no recognition. The stories that survivors tell themselves, the narratives that transform betrayal into necessity and cowardice into practicality, these were already forming in his mind. Justifications that would allow him to sleep in whatever bed that money purchased. Explanations that would satisfy conscience until conscience stopped asking questions that answers could not address. What happened in the basement room where education was given remains a matter of guessing and second-hand accounts. Stories told by men who claimed to have witnessed or participated but whose descriptions varied in details while agreeing on basics. The Colombo family sent 3 representatives who brought with them tools that plumbers use for legitimate purposes and criminals employ for instruction that leaves permanent marks on bodies and memories. The sounds that came from that basement, according to neighbors who lived close enough to hear but far enough to maintain believable denial, resembled nothing so much as an animal caught in machinery that would not stop turning, regardless of screaming or pleading or the kind of desperate bargaining that men attempt when pain exceeds their capacity to endure it with dignity intact. Caruso did not return to Brooklyn, did not surface in any hospital emergency room or police station or morgue that kept records accessible to investigators who might have asked questions about missing persons and unexplained disappearances. His wife received a visit 3 days later from men in suits who delivered an envelope containing $500 and instructions about maintaining silence that did not require explicit threats, because suggestion accomplished what direct statements might have made actionable in courts that occasionally took interest in widows whose husbands vanished without official explanation. She took the children and left for a sister's house in Pennsylvania, where Anthony's name was mentioned only once before family agreement determined that some topics were better left undiscussed and some absences were better left unexplained. Tommy Russo lasted 6 months in Brooklyn before the weight of $10,000 became lighter than the burden of memory and association. He was seen boarding a Greyhound bus in February of 1960, destination listed as Chicago, carrying a single suitcase that contained everything he owned that was worth transporting and nothing that would connect him to Noble Street or skylight entries or the specific sound of Anthony Caruso's voice when understanding arrived that preparation had failed. Records show he worked briefly in a meatpacking plant, then disappeared from official documentation entirely, becoming one of those men that cities swallow and digest and throw out into obscurity, where even determined searching produces nothing except rumors and possible sightings that lead nowhere except to other dead ends and abandoned trails. The Colombo family kept their word, a fact that speaks volumes about the politics of criminal business and the mathematics of respect between organizations that compete for territory, while recognizing that certain boundaries serve everyone's interests when maintained with consistency and mutual understanding. Harlem remained Bumpy's domain. Brooklyn operations that involved Harlem partnerships continued according to established rules, and no further incidents of theft or betrayal occurred within the joint venture. Because everyone who might have thought about similar theft had heard what happened to Anthony Caruso and decided that $50,000 was not enough compensation for education that left graduates unable to attend their own funerals. Years later, when Bumpy Johnson was laid to rest in 1968, a wreath arrived at the funeral home with a card that had no signature, but whose flowers had been selected with the kind of care that indicated respect rather than obligation, remembrance rather than social custom. Those who understood the language that such gestures spoke recognized the arrangement as coming from Carlo Gambino, an acknowledgement that went beyond family rivalries and territory disputes, a recognition that certain men operated according to codes that commanded respect, even from competitors who might wish them harm but could not deny them recognition of effectiveness and consistency in applying principles that lesser men merely discussed without understanding their true weight and consequence. 4 minutes had proven enough to take apart 17 years of career advancement and criminal accomplishment. To reduce Anthony Caruso from respected operator to cautionary tale that Brooklyn's underworld would reference whenever young men began thinking about whether theft from established organizations represented acceptable risk versus potential reward. 4 minutes from declaration of safety to understanding that safety had been fiction maintained only until Bumpy Johnson decided that patience had yielded enough tactical advantage, and the moment for action had arrived with precision that clocks could measure but Caruso's preparation could not expect or prevent. The transformation from confidence to collapse occurred with speed that seemed almost supernatural to those who heard the story in its various versions and editions, each retelling adding details that may or may not have reflected actual events, but which served the story's function of showing how quickly fortune reverses when assumptions prove incorrect and preparation proves not enough against opponents who understand that victory belongs not to those who build the strongest fortresses, but to those who identify weaknesses that fortress builders overlooked in their focus on obvious threats and normal approaches. In social clubs throughout Brooklyn, in bars where dock workers drank alongside bookmakers and numbers runners, in restaurants where families shared meals while their fathers conducted business that required privacy and care, the story of Anthony Caruso's 4 minutes circulated like currency that increased rather than decreased in value with each transaction. Young men who might have thought about similar ventures, who had been calculating whether their own preparation and planning could succeed where Caruso's had failed, reconsidered their math and concluded that certain equations contained variables that could not be controlled through mere thoroughness and attention to detail. No one dared steal from joint ventures that involved Harlem operations, understanding that Bumpy Johnson's patience should not be mistaken for weakness or inability, that his method of resolution would arrive not with the quickness of hot-tempered reaction, but with the deliberate certainty of planned response that had considered every angle and prepared for every possibility. The lesson had been expensive for Caruso, but cheap for everyone else who learned from observation rather than experience, who understood that education came in two forms, one delivered through example, and one delivered through direct participation in consequences that examples were designed to help others avoid. No one spoke Bumpy Johnson's name with contempt or dismissal. Recognizing that a man who could locate someone hidden in a city of millions, who could purchase loyalty that 17 years of partnership had failed to secure, who could enter through entrances that defenders had forgotten existed, represented a level of capability that commanded respect. Regardless of whether that respect came from admiration or fear or simple recognition, that survival required acknowledging hierarchy and accepting one's position within structures that predated individual ambition, and would survive long after individual players had been replaced by younger men who would learn the same lessons through their own mistakes or through observation of others' failures. No one believed they could truly disappear, could vanish into Brooklyn's industrial landscape and remain hidden through preparation and planning and security that exceeded what Anthony Caruso had achieved. If a man with 17 years of experience, with loyal friends and multiple escape routes, and 3 weeks of supplies and loaded weapons and careful attention to every detail that textbooks about evasion would recommend, if such a man could be located and extracted and educated within 4 minutes of declaring his safety, then what chance did lesser criminals have when thinking about similar escapes from similar consequences? The message spread through Brooklyn's criminal system with efficiency that advertising agencies would envy, spreading through networks that relied on word of mouth and trust, and the kind of informal communication that leaves no written record but achieves reach that formal announcements never accomplish. Bumpy Johnson had shown not merely that he would pursue those who stole from him, but that his pursuit would succeed regardless of preparation or planning or the confidence that thieves had about their own cleverness and ability to outwit opponents who had been solving such problems since before those thieves learned to walk. The demonstration required no repetition because its completeness left no confusion about outcome or method, no uncertainty about what would occur if others attempted similar theft and believed they could achieve different results through superior preparation. One example had proven enough to establish principle that would govern behavior for years afterward. Deterrence achieved not through multiple executions but through single case study that showed consequences with clarity that made additional examples unnecessary and perhaps even redundant. In his Harlem office, 3 floors above the restaurant where collard greens continued to be served, and backstairs continued to accommodate visitors who arrived after midnight with questions that required answers that daylight conversations could not provide, Bumpy Johnson finished the last glass of Barolo from the 1934 vintage that had accompanied him through the hunt for Anthony Caruso. The bottle stood empty on his desk, a monument to patience and planning and the understanding that true power comes not from violence itself, but from the intelligence and preparation that make violence unnecessary, except in cases where examples serve purposes that extend beyond individual punishment into collective education. Power does not flow from the gun or the knife or the gasoline-soaked rags stuffed into a bottle, Bumpy said to Marcus Webb, who had returned to report that the Colombo family had expressed satisfaction with the evening's resolution and had conveyed their appreciation for the courtesy of participation in Caruso's instruction. It flows from information gathered carefully, from patience practiced when instinct screams for immediate action, from understanding human psychology well enough to predict behavior and exploit weakness that targets believe represents strength until demonstration proves otherwise. Marcus nodded, understanding that this observation was meant for his education as much as for Bumpy's own expression of principles that guided decisions and shaped outcomes. The younger man would eventually inherit responsibilities that required such understanding, would face his own decisions about when patience served better than speed and when intelligence accomplished what violence could not achieve alone. The lesson of Anthony Caruso would serve him as it would serve an entire generation of criminals who learned that preparation without wisdom only meant dying with eyes open and mistakes catalogued rather than corrected. The Noble Street warehouse returned to darkness as the lantern finally ran out of fuel and died. The last light fading from space that had briefly contained confrontation and revelation, and the kind of reckoning that occurs when confidence meets reality and preparation, proves not enough against opponents who operate at levels that normal thinking cannot expect. The concrete floor remained cold, the walls remained indifferent, the shadows remained deep and welcoming to whatever purposes future occupants would bring when they claimed the space for their own ventures and schemes and calculations about risk versus reward. But the order had changed in ways that concrete and darkness could not reflect. In the understanding that every criminal in Brooklyn now had about what happened when men stole from Bumpy Johnson and believed they could hide successfully enough to avoid consequences that patience would deliver with precision that speed could never achieve. The Noble Street warehouse would house other criminals, would witness other conversations and transactions and the ordinary machinery of illegal business that kept such spaces occupied and profitable. But none of those future occupants would be Anthony Caruso, and all of them would know why his absence served as permanent reminder about the cost of certain mistakes and the efficiency with which Bumpy Johnson corrected errors that threatened the order he had established through methods that courts would never review but streets would never forget. Outside, Brooklyn continued its patterns: factories running shifts, bars serving drinks, the ordinary rhythms of a city that contained within it extraordinary violence and justice that operated by rules that no legislature had written but everyone understood with clarity that legal codes could never achieve. The East River flowed toward the ocean, carrying with it the industrial waste and human ambition and the built-up secrets that cities generate when millions of people pursue survival and success through whatever means necessity and opportunity provide. Tugboats continued their eternal circuits, horns calling through darkness to vessels that navigated by charts that showed depths and channels but could not indicate where bodies rested or where lessons had been given in basements that maps did not recognize and history would not record. The story of Anthony Caruso's 4 Minutes would outlive everyone who participated in or witnessed the events of August 23, 1959. Would be told and retold, until details blurred and facts merged with fiction, and the essential truth remained that Bumpy Johnson had shown principles about power and intelligence and preparation that went beyond individual case studies to become foundational understanding about how certain men operated, and why their operations succeeded when lesser criminals failed despite similar ambition and sometimes superior resources. These are the stories that survive, the narratives that serve purposes beyond entertainment, the lessons that criminal businesses pass from generation to generation, not through written manuals, but through oral tradition that preserves what matters while allowing peripheral details to fade into approximation and possibility. The lantern sat cold and empty on the warehouse floor, its fuel consumed, its purpose fulfilled, its light gone out like Caruso's confidence in Tommy's loyalty and the assumptions that both men had held about what preparation could accomplish and what loyalty was worth when offers arrived with cash in hand and consequences for refusal expressed through suggestion rather than direct threat. In the darkness that the lantern's death created, Brooklyn continued its eternal business, indifferent to individual tragedies and personal catastrophes, welcoming whatever violence and justice the night required while preparing for dawn that would arrive regardless of what happened in basements or warehouses or the countless other spaces where order was maintained through methods that daylight preferred to ignore but darkness understood with perfect clarity and absolute acceptance of necessity. This story is shared for historical insight and personal reflection, not to promote violence or illegal behavior. Thank you for watching until the end. These stories take weeks of research and writing to create. If this spoke to you, if you see the lesson Bumpy Johnson was teaching about accountability and education over violence, hit that subscribe button. Help us reach 1 million subscribers so we can keep telling stories that matter. Stories about power used wisely. Stories about consequences faced honestly. Stories about men who chose to change systems instead of just destroying enemies. The next video drops soon. Until then, remember, real power is not what you can destroy, it is what you choose to build.